Yes.
Retreat, teaching engagement. This is Pastor Alan Thorson is going to share with us his recollections and notes about
Okay.
his family.
All right.
Norwegian
That's a
family.
wide, broad subject.
Okay.
Thank you.
Wasn't where I thought it was.
Well, it's nice of you to have me here to share some things that I've discovered about my family, and also some things that connect to the ethnic group that I happen to be from in this particular area. Not that I'm an expert, because I don't claim to be a professional historian. I'm not a scholar as such, but I do have curiosity. And with that as a part of what I am and what I'm about, there's a lot of things that I find out, and occasionally I feel the need to share and to participate in groups like this, or in conversations and discussions that we might have. It seems to me that history is very important, because it has to do with answering the question, who am I? From whom did I spring? What is the purpose and the goal and the meaning in life? And then finally, what is my responsibility in terms of passing on what I know and experience to those who follow me or who come after me in life? And certainly that is something that applies to all of us. Those questions are ones that we're about, even though we might not always articulate what they happen to be. As you're aware from announcing this program, my ancestry is Norwegian. Of my 8 great-grandparents, seven of those were full-blooded Norwegian. 6 of them were born in Norway. The 7th one was a child of Norwegian immigrants, and the 8th one happened to be a Scotsman. Now that's a story in and of itself, but I like to rationalize and say, well, you know, the Vikings came down into Scotland, and it's possible that that Scotsman was more Norwegian than he realized. And in looking up the name and the Scotch name, the name had to do with the Norman invasion of Great Britain around the year 1000 or shortly after, 10-something it was. So there again might have been some Norseman blood that came to be mixed with the heritage that happens to be mine. I grew up in southeast Minnesota. If you know where the area is, if you think of Minnesota as shaped like a boot, I was born in the toe, just north of Decorah, on the border between Winona County and Fillmore County. Fillmore County is on the border with Iowa, and that particular area is very, very Norwegian, being settled in the 1850s, much like eastern Iowa was. And the Norwegian people who came to the Midwest essentially settled at first in northern Illinois and southern Wisconsin, and then they moved down often the Wisconsin River and crossed at McGregor in Clayton County, and then spread out from there, many finding land in northern Iowa, southeastern Minnesota, and then when a second generation of people were born to those folks, and more Norwegians came from across the sea, those people then went out to South Dakota, North Dakota, the Red River Valley, other parts of Minnesota, and so forth. In terms of Iowa, the northern tiers of counties were quite Norwegian in terms of numbers of people from that country. But it was kind of a breakthrough at one point where a number of them spilled south along what is now Highway 69, I think it is, and Highway 35 down to about Story County or Story City. And many Norwegian people settled in that particular area as well. It's said that today there are as many people in North America who claim Norwegian American heritage as there are people living in Norway. About 5 million people on both sides of the Atlantic. And Norway is second only to Ireland in terms of the percentage of its population that emigrated to the New World. Those people kind of dispersed. There was a man named Clang Pearson who worked with them in regard to finding places for them to live. A settlement along the east was contemplated and developed for a time, but a number of those folks ended up in northern Illinois, Wisconsin, and so forth. A few came into Iowa. And then in 1858, or thereabouts, the beginnings of a community of Norwegian Friends began in Marshall County, Iowa. There was good land and a few people came to the area. There were Norwegians already settling there. The Dunbar area had a lot of Norwegian people, or eventually did. And the people then began to accumulate. And there was a man by the name of, if I find his name here, I don't remember it, but a man who went to Norway, yes, Lindley Murray Hogue. I don't know if anyone had heard that name, but he had a vision, and being a Quaker himself, it probably was kind of an inspiration that occurred to him that over in Norway there was a special place, and there would be people there that they would be able to relate to. And so he went to the area of southern Norway, near Stavanger, and in his vision he saw a beautiful valley with the lake in it, and he searched but could not find for a considerable amount of time for this area that he had envisioned. And suddenly he discovered it at Rolldal in Norway. And there he found people who were very sympathetic in respect to the message of the Friends. Now the earlier people who were the Friends that came on the sloop, the sloopers, in 1825 were descendants and connected to a group of Norwegian sailors. Those sailors had been, many of them had been held in captivity in England because they had been sailors for Denmark and Norway who were affiliated with Napoleon and the French on that particular side of a great war. But Napoleon lost. I suppose that would have been Waterloo. He lost. And many of these Norwegian sailors had been captured, and they were kept on prison ships in the harbor, probably London Harbor, or maybe one of the other harbors in England. And there they more or less vegetated, kept prisoner. And the only people who were kind to them were people who were the Friends in England at that time. And because of the kindnesses and the consideration on the part of the Friends in England, when these sailors got back to Norway, many of them from the Stavanger area, they became Quakers themselves. And at the same time, there was a man in Norway called Hans Nilsen Hauge, and he led a pietistic revival movement within Norway. And many people were followers of Hauge. They were the Haugians. They always wanted to stay Lutheran, but they wanted the church to be reformed. Much like the Methodists in England wanted to reform the Episcopal Church and not be a separate denomination. But they related to the people who were the Friends. And so on the Slooper boat, there were a number of Haugian Lutheran Christians as well who came to this country. But after 1858, when Lindley Murray Hogue made his trip and went to Roldal and found these people, a group of 50 or so Friends from Norway came to America, and they landed in Marshall County, Iowa, and became the nucleus of a new congregation. Now, originally, the first families connected to the Friends Church in La Grande, and was not associated with an ethnic group. But because there were now so many Norwegian Quakers in Marshall County, they determined that they would be a separate faith community, and they established the Stavanger Friends Church. And it's the only Norwegian-speaking Friends Church that had any length of life at all in the United States of America or in North America. The only Norwegian Friends Church that has survived. As the years have gone by, I suppose you could say there's been some dilution. They've maybe forgotten a lot about their Norwegianness, and they may have become more affiliated with the regular Friends groups and called pastors from other denominations to serve them. So in terms of a rigorous adherence to Quaker principles, it probably isn't what it once was, particularly at the beginning. One of the things that the people at La Grande did, the Stavanger people, was to, after a while, establish a school. And they built a building, and there were many students at first. It was not only an elementary school, it was a secondary school. And so they yes, were responsible for teaching English, but also they wanted to preserve Norwegian culture and language as well. But as high schools began to be developed in the communities around, less and less demand was apparent for this particular school. And after a while, it was terminated. I don't know how long the building lasted, but they said that the building was torn down eventually, and I just don't know how long that lasted. When I grew up, my social, religious experience was essentially Norwegian Lutheran. My home congregation happened to be one of those Haugian churches. It was along Highway 30, along the Winona County, Fillmore County border, as I said, north of Decorah. And the non-Haugians built a church, and the Haugians built another church. They were 3/4 of a mile apart, and each one had close to 500 members at the high water mark. But they had different viewpoints, and being in America, you could express your religious convictions however you wanted to. that was one of the reasons why people left countries like Norway, was that if you came to a different conviction in regard to faith, you were often persecuted by the authorities. Because in a country like Norway, the one who was king was the head of the church, and everybody was required to be of the same church and the same persuasion. And if you opted for something else, you were unpatriotic, you were subject to even imprisonment or arrest. On top of that, in regard to the Friends, there was the pacifistic doctrine where you did not go off with Napoleon in a war and fight. You were, as you believed you should be, one who did not bear arms. That was one of the principal doctrines, as I understand it, of the Friends people. And so those folks came to America then to be free and to find land and to gain all the blessings of America and a place such as they found here in Marshall County. When I went off to school, I graduated from high school at Peterson, Minnesota, which is along the Root River Valley. Today there's that Root River Valley Trail just down the river from Lanesboro. And when I went off to school, I went to Minneapolis, but I went to a Norwegian Lutheran college, Augsburg College. Then I went to a Norwegian Lutheran seminary, a Luther seminary in St. Paul. My first call was to be a pastor in western South Dakota. Well, there was two congregations, but the major one had been a Norwegian Lutheran group that had been out in the country between the town of Philip and Kadoka, both of which are not too far from Wall, South Dakota, and the Badlands. Well, the people who settled there were pretty much that second generation of people. Many of them had grown up as children of immigrants in Minnesota or farther east, Wisconsin, gone out then as children to find land homesteading. But homesteading in western South Dakota was very difficult. You couldn't survive really on 120 acres or the small parcels of land because of things like droughts and grasshoppers and so forth. But in 1905, they finally got all of the counties organized in western South Dakota. And the people there around Philip organized a new county, and it was called Hawkin County in 1905. Well, many people don't realize it. Many people out there perhaps don't realize it, but that was the name of the King of Norway. King Hawkin in 1905 in Norway had begun his reign as the King of Norway. Because up till 1905, Norway was not totally free of domination from the country of Sweden. Part of the punishment for being on the losing side of the war with Napoleon was that Norway, tied closely to Denmark, had to stay with Denmark, and Sweden went off by itself originally. But the consequence of the war was that Norway was given to Sweden. But the Norwegians by that time, because of Haugians and because of the Friends and other rumblings in Norway, the people didn't want just a king like the rest of the countries in Europe had. They wanted some freedom and democracy. So they wrote a constitution in 1812. And though they didn't get that constitution fully implemented until 1905, that Constitution Day was May 17th. And if you happen to be Norwegian, you know what 17. Mai is. The 17th of May is in Norway what the 4th of July is in the US. It is a day of celebration, a day of patriotism, flag waving, and so forth. But as a Norwegian American, when Iris and I finally ended up in central Iowa, I could anyway, maybe she couldn't because she was mostly German, but I could feel that I was out of the influence of a dominating Norwegian Lutheran culture, even though I was serving churches that had many folks of that particular heritage. But currently I came to town to serve at Our Savior Lutheran in 1989 and served there 7.5 years. And when I reached 65, which is now 19 years ago, when I reached 65, I retired, and then our church membership was switched to Elam Lutheran. Elam Lutheran is the Norwegian Lutheran church here in Marshalltown. The Lutheran church at Dunbar, which was called Strand Lutheran, was the mother church in establishing Elam congregation in Marshalltown. As the city developed, there were Norwegian immigrants coming and people moving to Marshalltown from the countryside, and so the congregation was established in 1887. And in 1914, the current building at Elam Church was constructed. And I've seen pictures of the dedication of Elam Lutheran Church. And it has 2 huge flags at the dedication. An American flag and a Norwegian flag. Each one of equal size, and both of them happened to be red, white, and blue. So they were still hanging on to their Norwegianness. And it took a generation or two before they did away or drifted away from using the Norwegian language in their worship services. In 1970, or 64 rather, in 1964, I received a Bible which my great-grandparents had in their possession as a family Bible. And my great-grandparents, Thorson, everybody has, 4 sets of great-grandparents, 8 great-grandparents. 2 of mine were those who had this Bible. And because the family, what happened was my grandparents, my father's father and his mother, passed away the same year in 1964. My grandparents, Thorson. My dad and his siblings decided that because I was an ordained pastor, I should have the possession of the family Bible that my grandfather had inherited from his parents. But when that Bible came to me, I found that on the end papers, inside the front and inside the back, there were many written inscriptions that my great-grandparents had entered in that particular volume. I brought this Bible today, and this is the inside of the cover. There is more writing, and in the back there are several pages of written material. It's not in English.
Oh, I was.
We had no idea.
But I knew enough Norwegian, and because of the kind of inscriptions that are there, once you know what a word means, it gets repeated, having to do with baptisms, confirmations, and so forth. And so I wrote a story about what was in this Bible, and it's been published in this magazine or newsletter by a group that's called the Hadeland Log. Hadeland is the area in Norway where my great-grandparents came from. And the Norwegians have about 12 area associations in North America. I'm sure Stavanger must have an area association, so all Norwegians that are descended from people that came from that area can choose to belong to that. And it happens that my Thorson relatives came from the Hadeland area. Hadeland is an area between Oslo. It's not Oslo, that's a mispronunciation. It's Oslo. Oslo and Lillehammer.
Yes.
Oslo and Lillehammer, a small area here. And it's relatively flat. It's quite hilly and bumpy, it seems to me, not like the mountainous area in most of the rest of Norway. Did I knock something
Yeah, you
down
did.
here?
No big deal.
Oh, yes.
It's the thing.
You can just leave it
You
off.
unplugged it. Well, that's your microphone, come on, clip, it should say.
Yeah.
Yeah, you don't have to put it back on.
All right. I'll
It's
just
it's all good.
It's all coming through. All right. Anyway, this is what it looks like in terms of that particular area. And each of the major farms is listed here. And there is a farm called Kittelsrud.
Okay.
And this family that we now call Thorson, their original name was Kittelsrud. Kittelsrud is a place name. And among many Norwegians, if you left the place, you left the name behind. And so if you were Thor's son of Kittelsrud, then your surname in this country would apt to be Thorson. Or if you were Anders' son of Kittelsrud, your name in this country might be Andersson. And I asked people back in Norway what the name Kittelsrud might mean. And I was told that there must have been a man way back in history, probably in Viking times, named Kittel. Kittel is a Viking name. And Rud means clearing. So the farm started out as a clearing that a Viking by the name of Kittel had brought forth in order to start that particular farm. What I'd like to do now is to share information about what I found in that Bible. At the beginning, and you're free to look at this later if you'd like, at the beginning it says, "This Bible belongs to me, Christian Thor's son, born on the farm Kittelsrud in Gran Parish in Hadeland, the 16th of November, 1834. I was baptized and confirmed in the same place. My wife, Anna Lars's daughter, was born on the farm Skoyan, the 7th of October, 1831, in Lunar Annex in Jevnaker Parish in Hadeland, baptized and confirmed in the same place. This couple then came to America, and I'll read more about that later. But when they left the farm, Christian, my great-grandfather, was the second son in the family. And because he was the second son, he did not inherit land. His older son, Anders Kettelsrud, inherited the farm. Now their father, Thor Kettelsrud, was still in his 50s. But somehow he decided to give his eldest son the farm right now instead of later, at his death. And his wife, my great-great-grandmother, had passed away. Thor chose another woman as his wife, and he boarded the boat with Christian and Annie and came to America at the same time as they did, landing eventually in Clayton County, Iowa, and then walking up into Minnesota the next year to claim land in Winona County. Thor is an interesting fellow in that he maybe was too old to immigrate. Because I went to the internet and I Googled my great-great-grandfather's name, and bingo, it showed up as a name referred to in this book, which I already own, but I had not read it. It's called Norwegian American Studies, Volume 24, by the Norwegian American Historical Association, headquartered in St. Olaf College in Northfield, Minnesota. But Thor Kettelsrud's name came up, and he was the subject of several paragraphs in a diary that a man by the name of Mons Greenager had written about his experiences in America. And I'm going to share with you what Mons Greenager said about this fellow Thor Kettelsrud, who had come with his son and new daughter-in-law to America. And he says this: I must tell you, this is Greenager writing about Thor, I must tell you that during the Christmas season I paid a visit to a Norwegian settlement about 25 miles from here. A number of people from Hadeland lived there. All of them were doing quite well. They were free of worries except for Thor Kettelsrud, who arrived there last year. This spring he set out on his return journey, and by now is presumably nearing the Norwegian coast. He absolutely could not find satisfaction here in anything, no matter what it might be. Scarcely had he put to sea when he was seized by such homesickness that without exception everything that was a part of America was offensive to him. I have been told that he was willing to pay the captain a considerable amount of money to let him go ashore at Lindesnes. That's the last part of Norway you see when you're leaving. This the captain would not agree to do. And so Thor and his new bride came with the son, Christian, and Annie, and landed with them in Clayton County. But hardly 2 years went by, but what Thor was back in Norway. He did not like it. He maybe was too old. When he went back to the farm, the son Anders had the farm now. And so Thor set up a blacksmith shop on the edge of the farm, and he spent the rest of his life as an accomplished blacksmith. In fact, I found a book that has an article about him as a master blacksmith in Hadeland in Norway. And when we were there on the farm, this is not the farm, it's a neighbor's farm, but the farm would be behind or in front of me, so to speak. But there is the building that Thor built when he got back to Norway in order for him to practice his skills as a blacksmith. And the relatives who are still on the farm, descendants of Anders, they have a granary-like building with an upper loft, and it's just full of tools and items that Thor Kittelsrud made in his blacksmith shop in Norway after he came home from America. But interestingly, even though Thor hated it over here, and I'm told that quite a goodly percentage of immigrants had adjustment problems and did try to make their way back home. They were so homesick or so finding it so difficult here as pioneers. They did go back, and only we don't hear their stories in the glorified way that we might hear about the people who did stay. But Christian and Annie did persist, and let me read some more of what they wrote. He says, Christian does, his father Thor has gone back home, or did eventually. We were married at the Lunar Church the 10th of April, 1854, and immigrated to America the 20th of April the same year, 1854. We came here to America in July 1854 and lived for a year in Clayton County, Iowa. Coming here to Winona County the 10th of July, 1855. Our daughter, Randy Mariah, was born the 21st of December. And I'm not going to read everything that's said because they had 14 children. It takes a while to get through. But I'll read the names of each one. Our son Thorvald was born the 8th of June in 1856. Interestingly, a couple of years ago, a young man with almost the same name that I have, his name was Robert Allen Thorson, spelled the same way I spell Allen, and I'm Alan Robert Thorson. He emailed me. Well, he happened to be a descendant of this Thorvald, my grandfather's oldest brother. Our son Lars was born the 1st of May, 1858. See, this is before Civil War yet. Our son Martin Julius was born September 1859. Our daughter Karen Helena Janita was born September 2nd, 1861. Our son Anders, he's remembering his brother now, naming one of his sons after him. Our son Anders was born April 20, 1863. Our daughter Annie Karina was born November 11th, 1864. Our son Christian was born May 27th, 1868. Our son Ole Neil was born July 12th, 1868. Our son-daughter Tina Olina was born the 22nd of March, 1870 in Winona County, baptized by Pastor Magnus. She died the 10th of October, 1877, 7 years, 7 months old. And there was something in the history of the family passed down that one of these children one of the girls had been killed in a horse riding accident, and it most likely was this 7-year-old daughter. And then Christian writes, a human born of woman lives a short life and is of much trouble. He grows up as a flower or shadow and flies as a shadow, flees as a shadow, and is remembered not. And then our daughter, Nellie Elavina. Well, wait now, one thing about Tina. The name Tina means 10. 10. She was the 10th child. Her name, well, Tina, we would say, but I think they pronounce it Tina. Our daughter, Nellie Elavina, came out. Number 11. Baptized 1872. She also passed away as a young child. And there's a notation of grief and faith expressed in that regard too. Next came child Neil Tulvin. Tulv is 12. He was number 12. was born March 2nd, 1874. Then came our daughter, Martha Maria Tertina Decimina, was born April 23, 1876. And then finally, child number 14, our son, Olaf Titus Quartus Decimus, was born September 27, 1880. They use Latin, Quartus Decimus, 4 and 10.
4 and 10.
And Olaf Titus Quartus Decimus is my grandfather.
Oh, wow.
So I'm descended from the 14th
14th
child
child.
in this particular family. And he
Thank
was
goodness
born
they got
in 1880. Now, the mother of these 14 children lived to be 92 years old.
Bless her heart.
Just think
Oh my gosh.
how much time she was pregnant.
Yeah.
How much time she wasn't. would
Yeah,
probably
but-
be
How
more
much
important.
time she was. Every 2 years there was another
Oh,
child
my
until
God.
14 of them had been born. And they lived in a small house.
Sure.
It was originally the log cabin, but they had built onto it and around
Sure they
it,
did.
clapboard siding. It happened that my parents lived there when I was a small child, so I spent about 10 years there as a child, living in that same house that Christian and Annie and those 14 children.
Oh my gosh.
But when Olaf came along, number 14, his eldest siblings were long gone.
Oh, yeah.
This one that relative I found who was a descendant from the oldest brother. The oldest brother had gone to the Red River Valley in the Bonanza days, I think in the 1870s, as 2 or 3 others of the sons had done in order to find land and some prosperity in the Red River Valley between Minnesota and North Dakota, around Norway, North Dakota. And so that's what I found out in the Bible. Olaf, my grandfather, did not like the fact that he had his number in his name. I did not know it till I was about 25 years old, just not long before I inherited the Bible. But when I lived in Kadoka, there was a fellow there who had come from around Peterson, and he would ride with me to visit his relatives back near where my hometown was. And along the way one day he said, you know, I went to country school with your grandpa Olaf, and did you know that we teased him like everything because he had his number and his name? I did not know that. And that was news to me, but
Yeah.
this man in western South Dakota knew that my grandfather had that name. One of the things that is interesting when you find information like this is that you uncover naming traditions. One of the things having to do with the names in our family is the connection that many of us have with the Viking days. You know, the Vikings existed from about the 800s to about 1000 in terms of the centuries. And they were the raiders and the people who made their way all across northern and even down into the Mediterranean of Europe. The name Thor was the god of thunder for the Vikings. I had an uncle by marriage, his name was Odin or Odin. Odin was another Viking god. As I said before, the farm was Kittlesrud. Well, Kittel is a Viking name. Our son, who happens to be an archivist for our national church, but he also has a sense of history, and he named his son Tryggvi Thorson, and one of the Olafs, I don't think it was Saint Olaf, there were 2 Olaf kings close together, but one of the Olafs was named Olaf Tryggvi's son, So his father's name was Trygve, and he was indeed a Viking. So there's these traces of the Viking era that happen to be in our names. I have a very pietistic, very religious, devout cousin. And I said, Richard, do you realize that our name is derived from the name of a pagan god? He was rather unhappy to realize that. But at least our great-grandfather was Christian Thorson. So, and when the Reformation came, particularly in the 1530s to Norway, then a lot of the Norwegians began to use as names biblical names. Anders is a form of Andrew. And so there's Anders' sons. And there's Johann or John, Johnsons. And there's Peter, Petersons. And Paul, Paulsons. And all of these New Testament names that in a sense eventually turned into surnames because of the fact that you would take your father's name and turn it into a surname. When I inquired about the numbers being in names, I said, how common a tradition would that have been in Norway? And they said there were families that did that. That from the 10th one on, they had run out of other names. So they would put the number of the child in the name. And some of those names turned into surnames. So if you know of somebody named Elfson, that's 11 son. And if you know somebody by the name of Tullefson, that's 12. If you know somebody named Otteson, that's 8.
Yeah, but I don't know any of those.
And so there's a number of those numbers that show up as surnames. And maybe many of those families don't even know that about themselves or the history of names.